blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels,
The federal
upon
government
the
is cracking
levers.
down on eco-terrorism and being followed closely by the states.
For the second time in weeks, a young immigrant child has died while in custody at the U.S.
Here to
border.
help protect our water for our future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Hey friends, I'm Arnold Schroeder coming at you from the stultifying heat of California's Central Valley, and this is Fight Like an Animal. This time we are going to wrap up our three-part series on the biology of the right-left divide. And by wrapping up, I guess what I mean is that we'll be establishing a framework for a totally infinite, potentially infinite, but like certainly fairly open-ended series of subsequent discussions about what it would imply for political conflicts if the theory that we will get to the end of articulating today were true. And so in some sense this podcast will be a somewhat linear progression, kind of akin to an audiobook. There will certainly be some more self-contained material. And I'm also going to break away from the format of doing monolithic dissertations all by myself a little bit. I think, for instance, next episode I'm going to present an interview with my friend Ken Ward about climate change and why the current political landscape of hyperpolarized right-left politics is just totally incapable of grappling with ecological change. So, it's not the case that there'll never be anything within this podcast that doesn't form sort of a linear progression, but on some level, a lot of it really will build on a foundation of what's already come before it. Yeah, so I don't know. Like I said, a podcast, but also akin to sort of an audiobook. And yeah, this is a crazy time, of course, and it really does feel like we get into more and more dreamlike territory, essentially, with every passing day. It's sort of like the horrors accumulate in more and more bizarre and disorienting ways. And to some extent, that's, I think, I don't want to negate that. I think that what's happening certainly does warrant a sense of hallucinatory wonder. But I think that there is this defining feature that I find in many people's reactions to what's happening in the world around them of legitimate surprise. And you could describe this in any number of senses within any number of cultural and political echelons of our society. Certainly the mainstream institutional liberal media seems to have been in something very much like a years-long state of constant shock and bewilderment about certainly the behavior of Donald Trump, for instance, or just broader sort of processes of cultural and political change that are occurring right now. And, so it's like there's this sort of incessant, on any given day, you can tune into CNN or read the New York Times or whatever, and there really is. There's this incessant tone of shock, like, oh my God, he locked up children. And then a few months later, oh my God, the guy who locked up children wants us to shoot up bleach. And there's sort of never a moment where there's like a coming to terms with what that person is and his kind of fundamental nature, and therefore a capacity to encounter his behavior and not be surprised, or certainly to predict it. And then, likewise within the more like hard left kind of like progressives and anarchists and socialists and all that, there's this real tendency to be consistently surprised by what the liberal establishment media, how overtly they are willing to collude with the liberal establishment political power structure. So the extent to which the CNNs and New York Times and Washington Posts of the world are overtly colluding with, for instance, the Democratic National Committee and the Joe Biden campaign. And we're willing to craft falsehoods to, like the whole Russiagate thing, to diminish the power of Donald Trump. And so, and there is, once again, there's this tendency to spend day after day pointing out the ways in which the behavior of the establishment media deviates from standards of objectivity, or standards of just kind of like rational discourse in general. And so this feels like, no matter where one is in the cultural and political landscape, a truth that people are finding themselves just consistently bewildered by the behavior of people in other echelons of the cultural and political landscape. And, to some extent, I think that this is a very good window into the fundamental problem of self-referentiality that characterizes so much of political social conflict, like this very consistent tendency for people who have one particular set of cognitive tendencies and correlated like ideological outlooks to assume that the world at large is more like them than it actually is. Certainly. So if you look at the liberal establishment media discourse, it's certainly true that what they think they're doing is somehow diminishing the power of people in the more right-wing aspects of the power structure, and the cultural momentum of grassroots right-wing people who don't have any power, by pointing out how their discourse deviates from some rules of how it deviates from parameters that supposedly exist on what is acceptable discourse and what is acceptable forms of thought, or like valid forms of thought, how it deviates from an epistemology that supposedly we've all consensed on sharing, which we just haven't, right? And so time and again, you see entities within the news pointing out that something that Trump did or said is kind of racist, as if pointing that out will negate his ability to maintain power or perpetuate his agenda, which just isn't true, because people didn't ever consent to the epistemology that the liberal establishment media is employing. That they just didn't. And so what they're consistently doing is pointing out a set of violations of their protocols, which would really matter and would diminish someone's power if everyone were more like them than people actually are. If everyone were Jim Acosta, then what CNN is doing to try to negate Trump's power would in fact work. And likewise, in the more like activist, the left proper, not the liberals but the left, so much of the tactical and strategic paradigm that one encounters would make tons of sense if there weren't innate differences between people and everybody had some fairly similar set of perceptual coordinates as the people who are engaging in those strategies. When people say, hey, let's, what this corporation is doing is evil, let's go lock our necks to the doors of their office with bicycle locks. And I've definitely done this kind of thing before. This is self-critique. That would make a ton of sense and really matter and be really effective if everybody was more like the people who are doing it. And I think that also we can certainly say about elements of right-wing violence that it's self-referential, that the people there's a tendency within right-wing psychology to perceive the world as more generally dangerous and more generally full of violent, insidious characters. And I think that, and therefore to want to, for instance, build border walls or construct prisons or put more people in those prisons. And I think once again, this perception is perfectly valid, but also a lot more self-referential than the people who have it are aware. I think that the dangerous world is real, but the source of that danger so very often is the very people who perceive the world this way. So I think one way to think about this body of theory that I'm trying to present is to think of it as a means of overcoming the sense of surprise that, and I am subject to this too. I am absolutely subject to this too. I do the very thing that I just described of experiencing like constant sort of disorientation and wonder at both those things, at the extent to which the liberal establishment media is in overt collusion with liberal establishment political figures, and the extent to which the kind of like right-wing power structure is just, incoherent and trashy and evil. And so I think that what I'm trying to do is map out a set of sort of like a landscape of perceptual niches, a landscape of cognitive tendencies and correlated ideological and strategic paradigms that that characterize our species, that allow us to sort of, I guess, somewhat more objectively see the very rich, intricate differences that exist between us, and how there are certain psychological tendencies which make one better or worse at attaining power, and that there are certain behaviors and beliefs that are going to tend to be associated with those psychological tendencies. And so in some sense it's just a means of not being surprised. I think that win or lose, what I really don't ever want is to be having the experience that I find so many people are having, where I'm shocked that somebody in power was willing to do something in particular to keep their power, or that somebody was willing to harm somebody or something in some particular way in order to attain their objectives. I want a fight in which I think that it should be fairly self-evident that if you're constantly shocked by the behavior of your adversaries, you probably don't really have a strategy for defeating those adversaries. So I want a science that is predictive of the behaviors of those in power and of the dynamics of power. And I want to not be surprised. And so that's what some of this is about. And, on some level, there's always a sense in which you can navigate a bunch of complex theory to get there, or if you are simply willing to acknowledge sort of immediately apparent truths, you don't really need the theory. But that's just the thing, is that it's really, really hard not to indulge our cognitive biases. And one of our biggest cognitive biases is to see people as fundamentally more like ourselves than they actually are. When we speculate about what people are, we are introspecting to a degree that we're often not aware of. And so, like for instance, human nature is a good example of this. You can argue a ton of theory. You can look at broad similarities between human behavior and the behavior of other species. You can look at universal, cross-culturally universal aspects of human behavior. You can argue in a very technical and kind of sophisticated way that human nature itself actually exists. Or you can just be the kind of person who's willing to note the obvious, that human nature exists, right? And so there's a bunch of different ways in which the theory isn't always, strictly speaking, necessary to come to the appropriate conclusion, but because coming to the appropriate conclusion usually means navigating a bunch of cognitive biases that put us somewhere else. In the case of denying human nature, it's a cognitive bias to believe that humans are perfectible beings who can reach utopia sometime real soon. It's really helpful to articulate the actual sort of underlying reasons why things that could potentially be kind of intuitively obvious are true. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to elucidate the actual underlying mechanics of the very significant, interesting, complex differences between people and how they shape the political landscape and how they shape the configurations of power that determine whether any of us will survive, whether there will be life on Earth in 100 years, etc., etc. So the last time that we did one of these, I spent most of it talking about other species and the biology of aggression in other species, and how aggression is correlated with a rich landscape of idiosyncratic, like not particularly overtly thematically related traits, novelty seeking and behavioral plasticity, cognition, sexuality, diminished stress physiology, etc. And how this biology appears to be describing some version of the same set of traits that I described in episode 1 in the domain of political psychology and related sciences that are correlated with variation in political outlook. So what I'm presenting here is the theory that this biology underlies the landscape of political conflict that we experience in human societies. That variation and aggression and its correlated traits is not just a tendency found in a number of other species, it's also found in humans, and that the right-left political spectrum manifests this is a manifestation of this variation. So that's the theory. That's the premise of my scientific paper. And obviously, we could just say that because this type of biology is found in so many other species, including very closely related species, but also not even just restricted to mammals, that it appears fairly ubiquitous, or certainly very common, and that there's no reason not to think that it might be characteristic of humans. But obviously it's better and more rigorous if we can look at human evolution and what we know about humans and ask if there are any particular indications that this biology of neoteny, developmental delay, selection against aggression, is present in humans, has played a particularly significant role in shaping us. And the answer is emphatically yes. We could talk about this a bunch of different ways. The first is size. So Homo sapiens are the descendants of a genus called Australopithecus, which means southern ape, austral, like Australia. And Australopithecus didn't have brains that were all that much different than that of other great apes, or certainly not that much bigger, but they did walk upright on two legs. And males of Australopithecus species were twice as large as females. A 2-to-1 male-female body size ratio is associated with harem mating systems, a mating system where one male mates with all the females in a social group and none of the other males mate. And these are mating systems that are associated with very intense aggression, because the only prospect for reproduction is to beat every other male in your social group in a fight. And so, for instance, gorillas have harem mating systems and approximately 2-to-1 male-female body size ratios. So obviously, as humans evolved from our Australopithecus ancestors, the male and females converged on a more similar body size ratio. Males are just a little bit bigger on average than females. And so that's some pretty good evidence of selection against aggression. And we can also recall that domestic animals and animals experimentally bred to be like domestic animals also have more similarity in size between the sexes than their wild counterparts. So that's one sense in which we're kind of like domestic animals. And then there's evidence in terms of our physical appearance. We have a lot less hair than any other primate, right? And as we've all experienced, the emergence of hair on different parts of the body at different times is very much a process of development. So that's one sense in which we appear to be in an early stage of development with respect to other primates. Then also our skulls have a very juvenile shape. This is something that's been noted for, I don't know, like somewhere around a century or something. I know at one point, kind of early on in the discussions of human neoteny, one scientist said that with respect to other primates, humans don't so much have a juvenile skull shape as a fetal skull shape. Our skulls resemble that of more fetal chimpanzees than adolescent chimps. And people continue to churn out papers on the neoteny hypothesis. People continue to find evidence that we are physically like a juvenile version of our close great ape relatives. And then there's the developmental trajectory itself and the timing of our development. So like bonobos, we're dependent on our mothers for longer than chimpanzees. We're also dependent on our mothers for longer than bonobos. Humans actually take longer to reach physical maturity than any other primate. So that's developmental delay per se right there. And so those are some pretty compelling pieces of evidence in terms of development and our physical appearance. But I think it actually gets way more interesting and way more towards kind of like the domain of particular human uniqueness when we talk about cognition, right? Because that's what makes humans so spectacularly strange, is our runaway cognitive abilities with respect to any other species. And when you talk about human intelligence in any kind of remotely abstract terms, when you try to define what it is, what intelligence in general is in humans or any other species, you're always going to get something about flexibility, to something about the versatility of thought processes, to conceptualize things in different ways. There's just a very inherent relationship between what we mean when we say intelligence and what the term cognitive plasticity literally encompasses. If you throw any problem at evolution over and over again, it'll find a really sophisticated, smart way to solve it that won't require conscious effort, that won't require intelligence per se. So, for instance, if somebody throws you a ball, you do not need to solve an equation for a parabola to catch the ball, because evolution has grappled with a bunch of problems about navigating space and interpreting spatial relationships and the relationships between objects for such a long time that you just get to catch the ball kind of for free, right? You might be better or worse at it, but you don't need an equation for a parabola to do it. But if you want to do something like make a machine to catch a ball, in other words, something that evolution did not prepare you for, a problem that it has not consistently encountered and given you an unconscious mechanism for addressing, then you do need an equation for a parabola. So you have to be able to think of, to do something, to behave novelly, to exhibit more behavioral flexibility. You need to be able to think more abstractly. So, intelligence, cognitive flexibility, the capacity for abstraction, these are all kind of the same thing. And so we can think about these two things in conjunction. On the one hand, humans have an unusually long period of development such that we retain juvenile features into adulthood, and humans have an unusual degree of cognitive plasticity, intelligence, i.e., cognitive plasticity. So thinking about all of the biology we talked about in the last episode, where early development is associated with greater behavioral and cognitive flexibility, maybe what we're really saying is that humans are characterized by the retention of the developmental phase associated with cognitive plasticity throughout our entire lives. As and this is a hypothesis that has been kicking around for a long time in conjunction with all the evidence from development and morphology that humans are kind of like a very young great ape compared to all other great apes. People have noted that this could underlie humans' behavioral flexibility and large brain size. So Konrad Lorenz, the famous 20th century animal behavior scientist, phrased it like this. He said, "In man, investigative interaction with the environment remains preserved until the onset of senility, whereas with all animals, even the most intelligent and inquisitive, this represents no more than a brief phase in individual development." So that was written in the mid-20th century, and people continue to turn out papers indicating that neoteny, developmental delay, may be the mechanism by which humans' unique brain size and cognitive abilities evolved. We talked about the critical period in other animals, this phase before the fear response, when animals are behaving more flexibly and engaging in more exploration. We talked about how it's prolonged in dogs with respect to wolves, domestic as opposed to wild foxes. The neoteny hypothesis of human evolution, as far as cognition and behavior is concerned, is the hypothesis that humans are the most behaviorally flexible species because we exist for our whole lifetimes in a developmental state characterized by behavioral flexibility. And it is worth noting real quick that it can be true that humans are subject to a developmental delay in certain domains and not particularly in others. So, the timing of the emergence of our teeth might be a little later than in chimpanzees, but the timing of our brain development may be greatly, greatly prolonged. And so there's a genetic prediction that's more or less implicit in the neoteny hypothesis of human evolution. So if you recall that when we're talking about evolution through developmental change, we're not necessarily talking about every trait distinction that emerges from point A to point B coming about through some random change in our nuclear DNA producing a variation on a trait. What we're talking about is changes in the way that regulatory genes express the genome. So we're talking about changes not so much in the genetic sequence, but in what transcription products, what gene expression products the genetic sequence is producing at any given point in the organism's lifespan. So we would expect if development played a big role in human evolution, we would expect humans to be genetically different from our closest living ancestors more in gene expression profiles than in our actual DNA sequences. And this turns out to be true. There's a couple great papers that talk about this. One found that humans differ genetically from chimpanzees in two tissues more than any other, in the testes and in the brain. And these genetic differences are much greater in terms of gene expression profiles than they are in terms of divergent sequences of DNA. And so again, every gene codes for a protein, whatever its ultimate function is. The way that it initially gets there is by coding for a protein. So humans are more different in terms of the proteins that our genes are coding for than we are in the actual genes that exist in the nuclei of our cells. And then another paper found that human brain gene expression profiles are like those of juvenile chimpanzees, and that specifically this is true in terms of gene expression products related to brain development and growth, right? So that's pretty compelling evidence that humans' unique brain size and unique cognitive ability came about through a retention of the developmental processes of brain growth and development. And so, that's kind of what humans are. We just turn on the developmental genes for brain growth and organization, and we don't really turn them off the same way that other species do. And that might make us look a little weird. It might give us very little hair, and I don't know. I often think about what we actually look like to other apes and imagine that we look kind of like creepy, hyper-sentient children. But this evolutionary process also makes us good at behaving in very novel ways. And so we can also look at the evolutionary context of humanity, look at what we know about how humans evolved, and see if the Neoteny hypothesis is congruent with whatever we can infer about life for our distant ancestors. And, so in the case of bonobos, there is this hypothesized selective pressure against aggression itself, because bonobos are hypothesized to have found an easier life. The chimp-like ancestor of bonobos is hypothesized to have found an easier life south of the Congo River about 1 million years ago. So I guess the question that we would be asking is what selective pressure would have invoked this biology in humans? Perhaps there was selection against aggression per se for some reason, but another really interesting form of evolutionary theory that fits with the Neoteny hypothesis, and this is the interesting thing about the Neoteny hypothesis, is that it's not about a particular selective pressure. It's a biophysical mechanism for accommodating an evolutionary pressure. So what's fascinating about it is that a lot of different hypothesized evolutionary pressures that humans were subject to that made us the way that we are consistent with the Neoteny hypothesis. So it's a mechanism by which these evolutionary pressures could have played out. And this is particularly true of all the variants of the social intelligence hypothesis, or the cultural intelligence hypothesis, as it's sometimes called. And these come in infinite variants, but they all basically say that human intelligence largely evolved to manage interactions with other humans. And so all the tool making and differential equations and journeys to the stars and whatever else kind of came along for the ride. General intelligence is a byproduct of social intelligence. And there are multiple lines of evidence for this. I think one just very intuitive way is we can look at how different forms of cognition are easier and harder for humans, how there appears to be elements of cognition that are more developed than others. So in terms of social cognition, language is our paramount act of social cognition. And we start babbling to develop the neuromuscular coordination to produce language when we're infants, without any training or explicit encouragement or inducement. And we learn language without ever really consciously making an effort to understand its very complex rules. We know, to use an example from a book called The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker, we know to say, "It is raining," to make a statement, and "Is it raining?" to ask a question. We know to move the verb to the front of the sentence before the grammatical subject, and to raise the pitch of our voice at the end. We know to do that without anybody ever telling us that rule, and without ever having to consciously understand it. I mean, I don't know the rules of English. And this can be really sharply contrasted with the experience, for instance, of learning mathematics, which isn't necessarily inherently more complex than language, but it's certainly a different cognitive domain. It's very much more an act of general, it employs our general reasoning abilities, right? Our general capacities for abstraction. And the rules of math can only be, the rules of math require very conscious deliberation to learn. We don't just intuit them the way that we do language. So, that's one example of how it would appear that humans have a particularly well-developed capacity for social cognition, and that other forms of cognition that we're particularly good at with respect to other species may have kind of come along for the ride. And then there's also this paradigm of comparing the cognitive abilities of humans and chimpanzees. And so there's some other good evidence for social intelligence there. One paper looked at the cognitive abilities of 3-year-old humans and found that they were virtually identical to adult chimpanzees in terms of reasoning about the physical world, solving physical problems, but that 3-year-olds had much greater capacities for social reasoning. And then there's also the famous Dunbar's number. So John Dunbar correlated group size with the volume of the neocortex in a bunch of different primate species. The neocortex is pretty central to abstract thought and reasoning processes. And so the larger the social group, the correlation is positive, the larger the social group, the bigger the neocortex in a pretty large number of primate species. And so the reason that this research is kind of famous is because he extrapolated from the equation he got for all these other species to humans, and he said that if the line continued, human neocortical volume would imply that we had evolved in ancestral groups of approximately 150 people. So, and this gets brought up a lot in like all kinds of different media and writing, like, why is the internet driving us insane? Or what does the modern world do to the human brain, or whatever, because it implies this notion that the human brain is essentially structured to manage approximately 150 really meaningful social relationships, and that the modern world is largely incompatible with that cognitive parameter. So, and then a lot of the people who advocate the social intelligence hypothesis talk about the significance of alliances within primate groups, how it might have just developed as social groups became bigger and more complex as a way to form alliances that allowed individuals to survive and reproduce in many existing primate species. There's all these very complex behaviors that go into the formation and maintenance of alliances. Grooming, giving comfort after an act of aggression, helping, actually fighting with an animal when there's a violent conflict, reconciliation behaviors. There's all these elaborate protocols for maintaining alliances, and alliances really do have everything to do with primates' ability to survive and reproduce. So the social intelligence hypothesis is often about hypothesizing an evolutionary pressure for a greater cognitive ability to manage increasingly complex primate politics. And so that version of it is certainly compatible with the notion of selection against aggression, developmental delay, and neoteny. We would expect simultaneously better coalition making when there was more social tolerance and greater social intelligence, because selection against aggression is correlated with changes in cognitive ability, and particularly in terms of social cognition. So in both those respects, an evolutionary pressure to manage increasingly complex social interactions would be accommodated by developmental delay. And then another version that comes up kind of a lot of the social intelligence hypothesis emphasizes some cooperative task or another, like protecting fire, keeping fire burning before people learned how to make it, or cooperative hunting. And, again, all of these can be accommodated by the notion of neoteny and developmental delay. We talked about how, in the last episode, bonobos are better than chimpanzees at solving certain cooperative problems. We can imagine any number of cooperative problem-solving evolutionary pressures coming up that neoteny would accommodate by both creating greater social tolerance for more cohesive alliances, and also greater capacities just to communicate. We talked about how dogs and experimental foxes are better at inferring cues from like gazing and pointing. They're better at certain forms of communication than their more aggressive wild counterparts. So, those are some other kinds of evolutionary, like hypothesized evolutionary pressures that neoteny would provide a mechanism for accommodating. So, on some level, there's just a whole landscape of hypothesized evolutionary pressures, and neoteny is kind of always there to say, like, sure, yeah, I'll take it. Add that to the list of things that I can accommodate or achieve a response to. If it's about making tools, I can make brains more flexible. If it's about having the capacity to understand other people's intentions and internal states well enough to build big alliances, I can develop a greater capacity for social inference. So that's the neoteny hypothesis of human evolution, that species ancestral to humans experienced evolutionary change brought about by developmental change. And these developmental changes prolonged human childhood and adolescence, gave us youthful features for our entire lives compared to other apes, and made our brains bigger and our behavior more flexible than in any other apes or in any other species. And my hypothesis of the origins of political difference, the neoteny hypothesis, has been kicking around, like I said, for, I really think at least a century at this point. And people continue to write papers providing further indications that it might be true. And my hypothesis just extends the neoteny hypothesis to say that not only were aggression and its correlated traits a subject of evolutionary pressure, and not only were there evolutionary pressures that created wholesale shifts in these traits that characterize our entire species, but also that it produced variation in these traits, precisely as we see in other species, such that below certain thresholds of social and technological complexity, these differences certainly do manifest and certainly play a role in shaping how traditional societies, both the ultimate form that any one of them takes and the variation between them, because I think that traditional societies also very much do reflect the outcomes of power struggles and political processes. But that above certain thresholds of social and technological complexity, as our societies become mechanisms for increasingly differentiated forms of self-expression in general, which is so manifestly true on so many different levels in so many different ways in the world we live in now. Like, we are becoming, the human species is becoming an increasingly complex landscape of distinct frames of reference and distinct sort of increasingly self-contained perceptual paradigms, but that as we cross these thresholds of social and technological complexity, this innate variation in aggression and its correlated traits produces the right-left political spectrum, and that variation in aggression and its correlated traits, like variation in so many evolved traits, follows a normal distribution, and that is why we see the normal distribution of left-right political orientation that we talked about in the first episode, both within any given nation and globally as a whole, why there is a normally distributed right-left political spectrum with more people orienting somewhere towards the center and fewer people towards the extremes. That normal distribution reflects a normal distribution of variation in aggression and its correlated traits. And that is why we see such thematically consistent forms of social and political conflict play out in vastly different times and places. And so let's go through the list of particularly interesting kind of idiosyncratic traits that the right-left political spectrum encompasses that would be predicted by this hypothesis. Because I think that the primary appeal of the hypothesis is parsimony. It's the ability to explain a bunch of diverse phenomena with one mechanism that we know exists and is very likely present in the human species, rather than having to explain all these diverse phenomena through independent mechanisms that we don't really have any clear indication are happening. And so I think that one way to think about this is that as much as I presented the right-left political, I characterized the right-left political spectrum largely in the terms that political psychologists and other scientists who I read and whose work I value characterize it in the first episode, because I wanted to start within the framework of the existing research. But I think that all of the descriptions that I have read of the right-left political spectrum tend to simply not include or simply not discuss pretty important features of it, precisely because there just isn't a theoretical framework to encompass all this variation and all these kind of not very obviously related traits. And so what I think that this hypothesis does is it just tends to, it predicts a whole bunch of what we empirically encounter as right-left politics, and ends up providing a kind of more complete description of the right-left political spectrum than I really think is found in any of the existing literature. And rather than hypothesizing, a huge set of very elaborate and largely unknown mechanisms, it just hypothesizes one. It just says that the reason that all these idiosyncratic traits comprise political difference is because they're all under control of the same genetic developmental regulatory processes. So just like, animals having big round eyes and short snubby noses and being more sexual and being less aggressive aren't clearly thematically related. They just are all under control of the same developmental process. The right-left political spectrum, I'm hypothesizing, is just under the control of one kind of very powerful developmental process, and that's why there's all these kind of random elements that don't fit into any particularly logically consistent framework. So to go through the list of the right-left traits that this hypothesis predicts, number one, of course, is just the covariation of perceptions of hierarchy and inequality and perceptions of tradition versus change. So like I commented in the first episode, there's really no logically inevitable reason for these baseline perceptual orientations to be clustered the way they are. We could certainly imagine somebody being extremely hierarchical, but also a wanton lover of novelty, risk, and change. And we can imagine people being militantly egalitarian, but also horribly averse to risk, novelty, and change. And, certainly there are individuals in the world who would meet those characterizations, but statistically speaking, when we get to the level of wholesale conflicts within a society, statistical tendencies, the statistical tendency is for these perceptual orientations to be very clustered. And that is exactly what we would predict from the hypothesis. The second aspect of the right-left political spectrum I would mention, since we are, after all, talking about a developmental process, we would expect it to vary with age. Again, statistically, it's not going to be true that everybody gets more conservative as they age. I sure fucking haven't. But it's going to be true, generally speaking, of some very large proportion of the population. And that is true. People vote more conservatively as they get older. This has been noted for a long time. This just played out in the recent Democratic presidential primary, with older people voting for candidates that made them feel like the world was going to go back to the way that it used to be at some point, and younger people voting for radical social upheaval that would have given them any shot at all at survival. And the psychological metrics, which are most predictive of real world political behavior, voting behavior, party identification, but also self-placement on a left-right spectrum, are correlated with age. The C scale that we talked about in the first episode, your conservatism score is correlated with increasing age. And the right-wing authoritarianism scale that we also talked about in the first episode is likewise higher RWA scores are likewise correlated with increasing age. So that's another thing that we would predict from the hypothesis. The third thing that I would mention is right-left distinctions in attitudes towards sexuality, and specifically non-reproductive sexuality. It's hard to overstate the extent to which opposition to things like abortion, contraception, homosexuality, promiscuity, opposition to non-reproductive sex is a hugely motivating source of political conflict. Again, this question of transcending self-referentiality. If you're not subject to those particular cognitive biases, it is truly like bewildering to encounter and difficult to imagine on some level how profoundly emotionally and psychologically salient the ways that other people have sex is to some people, and how important it feels to them to regulate or prohibit certain sexual behaviors. And so again, this is something that we would predict from the hypothesis. Aggression and its correlated traits is one of those correlated traits is having more freaky sex more often. Bonobos are of course very famous for this, but this is also true of dogs with respect to wolves, experimental foxes with respect to their domestic counterparts. We see homosexuality emerge in a bunch of domestic animals where it's pretty rare or non-existent in wild counterparts. Homosexuality is patchily distributed in the animal kingdom. It's very present in a number of species in the wild too. But in species where it isn't present, when they become domesticated, it emerges. And the researchers use the terminology that less aggressive animals engage in more socio-sexual behavior, sex for fun, sex for social bonding, etc. So this is an aspect of the right-left divide we would predict from the neoteny hypothesis. And then number 4, another important difference in right-left orientations concerns gender and the extent to which gender roles are sharply differentiated. So you'll recall in the first episode I talked about how Republicans and Democrats can be differentiated by pictures of their faces alone, that study participants were able to classify faces as Republican or Democrat a very statistically improbable amount of time if they weren't actually noting some legitimate physical difference, and that they characterize Republican faces as more masculine. And, so then we can look at this biology that we've talked about and how males and females are physically more similar in less aggressive species. So this is true in terms of appearance, but of course it's also true in terms of behavior. The right-left divide is associated with sharp divergences in perceptions of how differentiated gender roles should be, and the degree of inequality, the degree to which males should be socially and politically dominant. And then number 5 that I would mention is variation in cognitive ability. So neoteny is a likely driver of humans' unique brain size and cognitive capacity. So of course variation in neotenous traits would probably be associated with differences in cognitive ability, and specifically with differences in social cognitive ability. And there is some evidence I talked about in episode 1, correlations between ideology and IQ in general, just general intelligence. But there are some indications that the difference mostly lies in the domain of social cognition. So for instance, there was a paper that looked at SAT scores, which are pretty tightly correlated with IQ scores. And it found a significant negative relationship between right-wing ideology and scores on the linguistic portions of the SAT, but no statistically meaningful correlation between ideology and scores on the math portions of the SAT. And so number 6 that I would mention are the physiological differences that are correlated with variation in ideological outlook. A wide array of right-left distinctions are correlated with variation in threat attentiveness and aversive physiology. So people with more right-wing ideology tend to perceive faces as more threatening. They have stronger physiological responses to threatening imagery or disgusting imagery or angering imagery. They're more startled by loud noises. And this would be predicted by the hypothesis because, as we discussed last episode, there's a range of physiological changes that animals undergo in selection against aggression where they have muted stress responses, the diminished reactivity of the HPA axis, things like that. And then finally, number 7, there's variation in aggression itself. This is the most primary kind of direct implication of saying that the right-left political spectrum reflects variation in aggression and its correlated traits. We should expect to see some variation in aggression. And we do. Right-wing politics are consistently associated with greater capacities for violence and greater ideological support for violence. And this, of course, should be assumed to probably have something to do with how power plays out in our societies, with who gets what kinds of power. And then real quick, because I think that something that distinguishes science per se from the many things that are kind of just like literary experiments that happen to take place in academic departments is whether a theory has predictive power. And so I wanna name 3. These are elements of the right-left political spectrum. What I've just described are elements of the right-left political spectrum that are consistent with the theory or would be predicted by it, but they've already been encountered and described. So I want to describe 3 predictions that the hypothesis would make that I don't think research has been done on yet. The first, maybe the most obvious, is that I think that there's some experimental evidence, questionnaire-based evidence that could be produced for variation in aggressiveness itself correlated with ideology in kind of the same way that political psychologists use these fairly abstract questions about inequality and change to predict ideology. I think that fairly abstract questions that are totally denuded of any explicit political context, could be asked about various situations and the levels of aggressive response that people would deem appropriate in those situations. And I think that could be correlated with ideology. I think that people would increasingly tend towards aggressive responses to hypothetical situations with increasingly high scores on psychological metrics of conservatism. And then the second prediction that I make in my paper is that social cognitive differences probably exist within the political spectrum that haven't yet been identified. So there's the research that's been done about perceiving faces as more threatening, but I think that experimental paradigms could be engaged which ask people to make a pretty large number of inferences about the internal state of another person based on whatever cues, based on body language, facial expression, incomplete statements, language that isn't totally explicit. And I think that there would be a correlation. I think people with more egalitarian political outlooks would tend to be able to make better social inferences in general, be better, more adept at inferring the intentions and internal states of other people. And then the third prediction that I would make is a genetic one. So in terms of the brain gene expression profiles that we talked about and how humans in general are characterized by a juvenile pattern of brain gene expression with respect to other great apes, I think I would predict that there is going to be variation with the human species in these profiles, and that people with more egalitarian politics are going to have more juvenile patterns of brain gene expression. So, there's a scientific hypothesis in the sense that it is attempting to explain a bunch of observed phenomena, but it is also making predictions about future observations, which I do, again, think is an important aspect of anything that really wants to call itself science. And yeah, so that is my theory of the underlying biology of the right-left political spectrum. And, maybe you are blown away by this. Maybe you are deeply, deeply skeptical. Maybe, and maybe, this might very well be the most common response, maybe you think, sure, okay, sounds potentially pretty plausible, but don't know that it matters. And, so obviously, what there is to do going forward is to talk about, if it were true, what it would all mean, what this would imply. And I think that I had to start somewhere, right? And as I talk more and more about my politics and kind of any conceivable politics that would allow for human survival and anything that anybody would call human well-being in the long term, we will certainly talk about more interesting differences between people than merely the right-left spectrum, because I think that what's so fascinating about the hyper-technological, hyper-complex society that we occupy is that on some level it's mapping out all of the incredibly diverse, intricately differentiated perceptual niches that seem to characterize the human species, that do have some pretty innate components. It's on some level, our hyper-technological age is mapping out all of the cognitive tribes that exist within humanity. And it's pretty fascinating, and to me meaningful distinctions in whether we are going to survive and whether the planet is going to persist don't really have that much to do with whether right or left politics dominates a society. I think that both, on some level, are just completely incompatible with long-term survival. I think that, to take ecological, there's a number of examples, but because ecological politics are a primary emphasis for me, to take those as an example, there's a pretty interesting book by George Lakoff, cognitive scientist at UC Berkeley, called Moral Politics, and he talks about some of the more abstract underlying narratives that recurrently manifest as left-right narratives. And so he talks about, in terms of left narrative or left morality, that nurturance and harm avoidance are kind of have kind of become the domain of the left. And then likewise, he talks about how discipline and the acknowledgement of limits and strength have kind of become like right wing, have become exclusively the domain of the right. And I think that ecological problems are problems that can only be engaged by a very direct synthesis of both of these sort of perceptual orientations. So on the one hand, it is absolutely true that the trajectory of industrial civilization is harming the planet and is going to kill everybody. And so on some level, one needs to invoke a morality of harm avoidance and nurturance, right? On some level, one needs to have compassion in order to develop an ecological politics. But then the story of the ecological crisis is also, I mean, it's not about changing light bulbs. There is no technological magic or market magic that can be undertaken that will completely, that will negate the ecological crisis but allow us to live the way that we are currently living. The ecological crisis is also very much a story about how the world has limits that must be respected. And in order to respect those limits, we must have discipline, and we must have like a certain strength in order to confront the hardships that come with not living in a hyper-technological consumer civilization. So, from my perspective, ecological politics are not right-left politics, and right-left politics are totally incompatible with ecological politics. As much as in our hyperpolarized society, everything has become a right-left discussion, and so every issue has to, somebody, one side or the other has to take any given issue and say, this is ours to advocate, or this is a truth we embrace. And so it's very much become true that environmental issues are now leftist issues. And but I don't think that left politics are at all compatible with ecological survival. And that's actually something that we will talk about in the very next episode. I'm going to do an interview with my friend Ken Ward, and we'll talk about his experiences of many decades of trying to intervene in the climate trajectory and the ways in which left-right politics, but left politics in particular, because that's really what has subsumed all environmental struggles, the ways in which they are simply incompatible with meaningful outcomes on those issues. But I do think that the existence, the question that we have to ask is whatever kind of politics we're advocating, whatever outcomes we're ultimately orienting towards, what does the fact that the right-left political spectrum is so prominent and characterizes so many societies and is the form of division with which so many people are so powerfully occupied, what does that imply about the outcomes of political conflicts and whatever agendas we might be pursuing? And I do think that to somewhat take a side, I do think that ecological politics are only compatible with societies where there is a fairly significant diminishment of material inequality from what we've seen right now, and because material inequality is maintained through the biology of aggression, right? So I think it is kind of manifestly obvious that the more that our societies are doing things like invading other countries and building border walls and stuff like that, the more manifestly absurd it is to talk about radically restructuring the economy to live within ecological limits or anything like that. So I do, as much as I don't orient towards right-left politics per se, mapping them out feels important because it's about asking what has to be navigated to get anywhere good. And I do think that diminishing inequality it's also, it's necessary for any ecological politics to play out. It's also just kind of a core moral priority for me. And but again, to not be on the left-right spectrum, I'm militantly opposed to the manifestations of material inequality that play out in our actual society. And I think it's evil and terrible on so many levels. But I'm not saying that people are actually equal. I think that it's utterly meaningless to say that people are different and that this diversity should be respected, and to say that everybody is equal. People are not equal. They are not equally funny. People are not equally smart. People are not equally prone to putting children in cages at the border. People are not equally fearful. People are not equally good at math. And so there's this incredibly rich landscape of differences that characterizes the human species. And I think that leftism is so concerned with creating a society of at least material equality that it also has tended to really militate against the acknowledgement of inequalities in other aspects of the human experience, and that this has been one of the central kind of like paradigmatic catastrophes of leftism, that the inability to acknowledge differences between people has had a bunch of really profound, unforeseeable consequences that have made it kind of a ridiculous and ultimately pretty insidious force in a lot of ways. And I will talk about that a whole lot more. I'll talk about the ways that leftism evolved out of academic frameworks, the way that leftism as it's currently incarnated evolved out of academic frameworks that were really wrapped up in denying both human nature of any kind, but then also differences between people. Those are two different things, but both those things, any biology of human behavior essentially, and how that has had a very complex like evolutionary trajectory towards what leftist politics are today, that has been an utter disaster. So, I'm not saying that I really embrace the leftist version of equality, but I do think that material inequalities and the biology of aggression per se, territorialism, intense hierarchical accumulation, outright aggression towards one another, war, incarceration, things like that. I do think that these behaviors are fundamentally incompatible with a survivable form of society, with a form of society that would create any prospect of humans or the planet surviving for very long at all. And so there is some sense in which the right-left political spectrum does imply this basic question of, if people are fighting for more or less equality, what are the other perceptual biases that people who want equality have, and what does that imply for trying to create survivable societies? What does it imply in for instance, like we've talked about, if people who want equality also tend to just be less good at aggression, does that mean that the people who are better at aggression and want to create more inequality are just going to kind of always win? Or, alternately, we can talk about how if people who want equality tend to just be better at sort of social cognition, and should we expect to see people with more egalitarian politics taking power in domains that are more like primarily cultural, that are more about language and thought and cultural production, whereas people with more aggressive tendencies tending to have power in more physical domains, for instance, comprising the police and having greater concentrations of wealth and actual, power in those senses? I think that is the world we encounter. So, there's just all of these really intricate, interesting questions that come up that come up from characterizing the right-left political spectrum in the way that we have. I think that the way that I've characterized it, I think that this hypothesis that I presented is highly predictive of some important aspects of the socio-political landscape. But my question isn't how do we make the left win or how do we make the right win. My question is how to make a society where there's any chance of survival. And what I'm ultimately going to be saying is that this is a process of synthesis, as I hope the example of right-left narratives and how they both are encompassed by ecological politics and how exclusive orientation to one or the other of them is incompatible with ecological politics. What I'm ultimately advocating in the domain of ecological politics and just in general in terms of the social trajectory is synthesis. What I'm saying when I say that our societies have created the capacity for hyper-differentiation is that, you know, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to see all of these unique sort of like thought processes and modes of reasoning that are particularly pronounced in some people, and how our societies have become complex enough that those people can kind of differentiate into their own little tribes, with their distinct epistemologies and information landscapes and forms of reasoning. And but how in the end, all of these tendencies kind of do exist in all of us, right? What I'm saying about the right-left political spectrum is not that these are perceptual orientations that are just utterly irreconcilably, fixedly different in us, but that we contain all of us contain all of these perceptual orientations, and the right-left political spectrum is variation in the thresholds for orienting towards one of these truths over another, but that all of these things can actually be contained, all of these different truths that different kind of cognitive tribes primarily emphasize in our current hyper-technological, hyper-differentiated society can be encompassed in a single perceptual paradigm, in a single worldview, and in a single politics. And so what I'm always going to be advocating on some level as I try to map out all of these fascinating cognitive differences between people is an act of synthesis towards a cohesive form of being. So, you know, on some level, the right and the left, I think, to engage in a really fairly crude but kind of useful simplification, I think on one level is a politics where one tribe has sort of exclusively embraced compassion and one tribe has sort of exclusively embraced strength. And that's putting it nicely. And then I think that the way to put it in very hostile terms would be to say that one tribe has kind of embraced weakness and one tribe has kind of embraced being monsters. And in a conflict between weaklings and monsters, I am not on anybody's side. And again, maybe that's a little bit overly scathing of a way to put it, but the point remains that I think that within the entire landscape of hyper-emphasized perceptual differences that currently exist, there's often some important truth that people are emphasizing that can be integrated into a cohesive perceptual paradigm, and that the problem is often not with the very truth itself, with the thing that people are emphasizing, but it's with the tendency to emphasize it to the exclusion of everything else, which is exactly what is meant by the term frame of reference, right? Which gets thrown around a ton in all these different ways. You know, people are like, well, how did you frame that? But they're really just talking about how you talked about it. But what a frame is, you know, like the idea came out of trying to teach computers how to behave like minds, and realizing that computers would always orient towards way more infinite, like a way more infinite set of possibilities than minds did, that problems which seemed simple and had a pretty intuitive path of reasoning for a mind didn't with computers, because there's a very unconscious set of limitations that we're employing, an unconscious set of general assumptions that we're employing about what the world looks like and how a problem can be solved that a computer isn't. So you have to create a frame for the computer, right? You have to create a set of limitations, and that's what a frame of reference is in terms of human perception and in terms of all the different political and cultural echelons that exist within our species. It's a tendency to, it's never an explicitly articulated set of limitations. It's a tendency to invoke certain forms of reasoning and certain evidence and to acknowledge certain facts that tend to exclude consideration of other aspects of reality and other facts and other forms of reasoning. And so the question becomes how to embrace any given truth without losing the capacity to embrace any other given truth. That, my friends, is the vast, ponderous question which we are engaging in this series. And so that is where I'm going to stop for now. And next time, like I said, we're going to interview my friend Ken, and we're going to talk about ecological politics and right-left politics and how they are really not the same thing at all, despite what people on the right or the left are insistently saying. I hope that you've enjoyed listening as much as I've been enjoying making these. If you'd like to stay connected on the internet, I, being the master of promotion that I am, made a Facebook page. So go ahead and like Fight Like an Animal on Facebook. And as I continue, I'm sure I will develop more of a capacity for dissemination and promotion. Thank you all, and take care, and I will talk to you again soon.